In today's episode of Joe Knows Retirement, I'm going to do a little paradigm shift on you if you've been watching this channel for a while. Typically, you've heard me say all these great things about a Roth IRA, great things about a Roth conversion, and how this is so popular right now, and how a lot of our clients who have pensions and $1 million or more saved are doing Roth conversions or putting money into a Roth IRA for all of the benefits that come long term. And so in this episode, though, I'm going to tell you about 8 reasons why you should start to take out money from your Roth IRA, or maybe when it can make sense to take out money from your Roth IRA. So this isn't something I typically talk about, but I want us to be aware of the pros and cons and when you need to be taking advantage of opportunities. So that's what's in store of today's episode.
Joe knows taxes.
Joe knows the market.
Joe knows Social Security.
Joe knows income planning.
Joe knows pickleball? No.
This is Joe Knows Retirement.
So whenever we think of Roth IRAs or Roth conversions, we always want to think of where are we at now from a tax perspective and where are we going to be in the future. Now, if you have that, if you're that 2% club that we talk about often, where you have a pension, only 20% of people, and you have over $1 million, only 10% of people in the population of the US, you combine those two percentages. If you're in this 2% unique crowd, then it may make a lot of sense to pay your taxes now because you may never be in a lower tax bracket. You've probably been told that all your life, but that probably doesn't exist to you. If you have $1 million in a pension, you're probably going to be in the same tax bracket or higher. Who they're talking to is the other half of people who maybe don't have as much money, and they're always going to stay in the standard deduction. If you have $30,000 of income in retirement and under the current rules, and you pay no federal taxes, and so also you may not be there with a pension. Your pension may take up all of that, plus your Social Security is probably not going to become taxable, and then obviously you're going to need to be required to take out investment withdrawals due to what's called a required minimum distribution. And so if that's you, then you may be in a different position. So for example, let's say that someone has $500,000, they have no pension, they have, a moderate amount of Social Security. Well, they may never have to take out significant amounts from their investment account. At RMD age, they're going to be required to take out about 4%. Well, 4% of 500,000 is only 20,000. I just mentioned you get 30,000 of income tax free. So in that situation, that person will probably be in a lower tax bracket in retirement. So you may have some friends in that position, and that may be the case. For those that are in the opposite end, right, the 2% club, that's probably not going to happen where you're going to be in the standard deduction. You're probably going to be in the higher tax brackets. And you're probably also going to force Social Security to become nearly fully taxable. 85% of it can be taxable as income. Plus, you're going to have RMDs that are putting you in higher brackets that could maybe force you to pay more, and even Medicare premium if you're 63 and older at that time as well. And so that's something you really, really want to be aware of. And so that's kind of the consensus that we look about when we think about Roth. But let's play this out, and I want to talk and get you to think about times when that Roth will be advantageous, right? Because if we are doing all these Roth conversions, maybe we've already done these Roth conversions, what is it good just sitting there growing over time? We do know that when you leave that Roth to your spouse, maybe when you pass, you can avoid the widow's penalty, which is something we'll talk about here today, or when you pass it to your kids in one day. So we'll talk about all those things, but let's start off with just understanding the higher tax times. And so right now, historically, is a lower tax environment, but who's to say that taxes over the next 20 plus years could go up? And in those times, that's when we really want to use the Roth in times of higher tax rates. So right now we're historically low. And so in this case, that's why you're seeing us talk a lot about Roth conversions, because we're paying taxes now at lower rates versus later at higher rates. But if tax rates go up, that's something that we want to be aware of. The second thing that we want to be aware of and when to take out from Roth is maybe you're teetering on the tax brackets right now. Maybe you're in the 24% bracket, and if you can reduce your, or maybe you're in the 32% bracket, and if you could reduce your income by $10,000, maybe that's the difference of taking from our Roth instead of our IRA to get that extra $10,000, and now we can save 32% in tax when we're probably expected to be in that 24% or even lower than 32% in the future is when the Roth can make sense. Or maybe you're in that 12% bracket and $10,000 is what you need to take care of the furnace that went out, and you have the option to take out from your Roth or traditional. But if you pull out from your traditional, that's going to push you up to the 22% bracket. And if you're figuring out that you're going to be lower, maybe that makes sense to take out from your Roth. And so we really want to understand those opportunistic times. And maybe it's a matter of, maybe you take out 30,000, maybe you need 40,000, maybe you took out 30,000 from your IRA, but then the last 10 you took out from your Roth to allow you to not go up tax brackets. Now, that's not something we're seeing very often now, but something to consider moving forward, especially with the 24% bracket. I mean, most people with pensions million plus, 24% bracket is probably a relatively low bracket, which your income can be nearly $400,000 or more and still be in that 24% bracket. So probably not going to be over that unless you're a really high income worker. Maybe you have a spouse that's also a high income worker and you're getting ready for retirement. Maybe that could be you. But even if you have hefty pensions, not too often are we seeing even people with over 200,000 or 250 is typically some of the higher amounts we're seeing between pensions or dual pensions that someone could have. And so there's still going to be quite a bit of room to take some money out at that relatively low tax bracket, as we would call it. The third reason why you should look to take out from a Roth IRA is, what if you have just an uncommon year? Maybe you have a year where you have a sale of a property, or maybe you have a big inheritance coming in and you're going to have a big tax bill that's due, or maybe you have a high payout from your job. Maybe you retire, you've got a lot of sick pay that's going to be paying out, or you got a big bonus at work, and those are times when maybe you do need some extra money and you take from the Roth in those examples, or maybe you don't even look to do Roth conversions in those times, and maybe you even contribute to an IRA and actually defer your taxes or contribute more to your traditional 401k. And that, again, back to our principle starting out this video, the key is to pay the tax at the least amount possible. So maybe you're doing a Roth conversion now at 24%, and let's say down the road the tax rate's 30%. Well, taking out from the Roth at 30% would be a great deal there. And so that's the consideration when we think about high income years that could come up. The fourth one that is really important for those who are seeking early retirement, or maybe are in early retirement. And we think of early retirement as anyone that retires 65 or younger. And so before Medicare starts for health insurance. And so you're aware that you're going to be responsible for your own health insurance if you retire before 65, unless maybe your employer offers that coverage to you in retirement. If that's the case, then you probably got a really good deal. Or maybe you consider working part-time or even full-time at something that's a little more enjoyable for you. Then maybe they provide health insurance and you don't have to worry about getting it on your own. But one consideration, there's many considerations to look at with health insurance before 65, and we have a health insurance specialist on our team who helps all of our clients find what the best deal is in the marketplace, what are their health concerns, what are their medications, and then helps them fill the gaps to make sure that everything is in place and that they're going to have a plan moving forward. And so we would encourage you to work with someone in that space if you are looking to get health insurance before 65. You can do IY, but you might as well get the help from the expert that does it every day. And so in this case, one thing that people often look for is the Affordable Care Act. And so the Affordable Care Act is going to be based on your income. And so the lower your income, the less you pay for health insurance. The more your income, the more you'd have to pay due to the way the Affordable Care Act works. And so for a lot of people, they may try to keep their income low so they can keep their health insurance premiums low in retirement. I can tell you that can be a great strategy to do. It's about 50-50 of those who we encourage to keep their income low versus those who, hey, this isn't worth it. We got to keep our income higher to take advantage of Roth conversions or income withdrawals or whatever it may be. But if you are in that category where it makes sense to lower your income to pay less in the health insurance, and that makes more sense than all the tax savings that you could get, then taking out from your Roth in those years, if you still need income to live on, maybe you don't have any non-qualified or taxable accounts like we've talked about before, this could be a way to get the income you need to live, not cause any big taxable events, and get the savings in your health insurance. So a great strategy to consider there. The fifth reason why it could make sense to take from your Roth is when it comes to those Medicare premium tiers. So this is the opposite end of retiring early, but this is if you are 63 or older. This is when your Medicare premiums can start to get calculated at 63 when you turn 65. So it looks back 2 years. So you want to make sure you're planning for this early. And so at that point, if your income is higher in 63, at 65, you could pay an extra $1,000 or even more for health insurance with Medicare. And we always recommend people do Part B in most cases, and then typically a supplemental plan on top of that. Now, that could depend on your situation, but in most cases, that's something that everyone wants to look into doing. We also have a Medicare specialist on our team to help our clients ensure they're shopping to different plans and making sure they get the best coverage there in place for what their needs are. And so with these Medicare premiums, think of it as a cliff. You could be $1 over that limit, and you would have to pay, more in Medicare premiums. Now, what if we knew we were going to be $1 over and we did need that extra dollar for our retirement plan? Well, what if we just took that dollar out of the Roth, we were under the limit, and now we didn't have to pay any money? Now, I know I'm exaggerating with the dollar example here, but we've seen people with their former advisors before they jumped over to us, they were $100 over the limit or $1,000 over the Medicare tier, and they had to pay the extra money when they were just over it. If they would have just been slightly over, they would have saved some money. Or they could have expanded that and done, a Roth conversion or taken more money out of their IRA to go up to the next tier so that they could utilize those lower brackets, during their early years of their, retirement is ultimately something to consider at that point. So the Roth could be an example. If you need money and you're right there at the tier, make sure you take out from the Roth. Now, you really need to do your calculations to see where you sit here. It is more of a complex calculation to make sure you understand how all the income plays together, but that is something that we would highly encourage your advisor, if you're doing this on your own, to make sure you're tracking. The sixth thing of when it can make sense to take out money from the Roth is what's known as the Social Security tax torpedo. So if you have not taken Social Security, maybe that's a reason to start bumping up your Roth accounts and starting to do more of those contributions and conversions at that time, so that when you do get to the age you start taking Social Security, we have to remember that now your Social Security is likely going to be taxable, and that's something that we have to consider. And so if your Social Security is likely going to be taxable, then the way it works is that your Social Security could be tax-free depending on what your income is. We call that, if you're low income, you could have your Social Security tax-free. But as soon as your income starts going up, then your Social Security starts to become more taxable, and it could be up to 85% taxable. Now, there's something called the Social Security tax torpedo. I've done some other videos on this concept where you actually could pay an all-in marginal tax rate of 40%. People will go, well, that's not true. You can't pay a 40%. There's no 40% bracket. Well, when you go from 12% to 22%, and then you have to worry about paying extra tax on your Social Security that you would not have if you wouldn't have taken the money out, is how this can all play together. And when you're right near that cliff, maybe it makes sense to take out money from a Roth so you don't have to pay that 40% tax. If you need $10,000 and you were to take it out on top of the torpedo, then you're only keeping $6,000. Versus if you take it out from the Roth, well, now you get your $10,000. You don't have to worry about paying that big tax bill. And so that could be a reason why in retirement you strategically look to take money out from a Roth. And that's something that we do with a lot of our clients who are near that limit. Maybe they have a smaller pension or maybe a little bit of a moderate pension, and they're starting to force themselves into that Social Security tax torpedo. Then that's something we want to have the ability to take from either an IRA or Roth. We want to take an IRA up to it and then a Roth while we're in it as a consideration. Now, if you have a big pension, maybe 6 figures or even more, then maybe this is something that you're not going to worry about, because you always are going to probably have Social Security be that 85% taxable. And so that's something, just understand, it's going to depend on where you're sitting throughout your retirement. Now, the seventh thing, as we mentioned earlier, that we want to look to take out a Roth from is when it comes to what's called the widow's penalty. Now, this may not exist right now, or maybe you did have a spouse pass away. Now, understand in the year the spouse passes, you can still utilize married filing jointly rates. So this may be not something you want to jump on right away, but in the years after, when the tax rates go from married filing jointly to single, that's going to mean that single filer is probably going to have to pay nearly double the amount of taxes because of the way our tax system works. And this is one of my least favorite parts of the tax code, but it's also one of the most important things to plan for if you're a married couple, especially if one's in maybe poor health or one's expected to pass away sooner. You could be left with not only higher taxes, but also you could lose one of the Social Security benefits. And obviously you have to be aware of your pension and if that's going to have a 100% survivor option, 50%, or maybe you didn't select it, or maybe you look to do life insurance. You have to make sure there's enough coverage there for that spouse. So that's one of the considerations to think about there. But when it comes to the widow's penalty and the tax, if we're going to be at single rates, that's why it could maybe make sense while we have these married filing jointly. Let's start getting money to in the Roth. Let's start stockpiling, as we talked about earlier, so that if this happens, now we don't have to worry about our IRAs. We can just take from the Roth, and instead of us, being in the 12% while we're married, now we're in the 24 if we're single. Let's make sure that we can take out from the Roth at 24 and put it into the Roth at 12. And so that's kind of the concept of the widow's penalty that we want to look at. And now the eighth point that we want to consider is beyond both you and your spouse. Let's think legacy, as we talked about this one also earlier. And this is when you want to leave money to your kids. And so that's when the Roth can make a lot of sense for them, because now they have a 10-year period to take it out of. And if you leave it in the IRA for them, they have to take all of that out in 10 years. And remember, most people watching this channel are extremely diligent savers. They're going to be in a great position, and they're going to likely leave a legacy behind if they choose to. If they don't end up spending all their money, which most people on this are the Midwestern millionaire, and we have to force them to spend money. And so in that case, in the Roth, now they can take it out tax-free. And in those cases, we want to try to wait as long as we can to get all of that growth tax-free. And so maybe your kids are in a higher tax bracket than you are now. That could be a reason. Now, if your children are in a lower tax bracket, maybe that's where a Roth doesn't make sense. Maybe you want to use a Roth during your years instead of their years. And maybe, if you're in the 24% and they're in the 12%, well, let's use the 24% now with our Roths and then leave them the IRAs, which, may not be as taxable to them. Now, that's something you have to be aware of, because what our tax rate's going to be in the future, we don't know. And so we have to be aware of how all that plays together. And so those are the 8 things that we would tell you to consider of when it makes sense to take a Roth. And that's one of the biggest reasons we recommend a Roth, is to have that what we call tax diversification. And so many times we see people have all their eggs in one basket. All their eggs are in tax deferred and very little is in tax free. And so now is a great window of opportunity of time right now, with tax rates lower, to look at doing things like Roth conversions that we talk about often, or contributing to your Roth 401k or IRA, starting to balance this out. And as I always say, we don't want all of our eggs in one basket from an investment standpoint. So from a tax standpoint, we probably don't want to either, so that we can have financial freedom and control in retirement to choose which account we want to pull out from. We're not forced by Uncle Sam to always pay taxes anytime we need some money. Anytime an emergency comes up, we get to choose what the taxable event is. But also, if we have a rock solid plan, we know that when we take out $10,000, where that's going to put us and how much total tax is that going to be. And that's one of the important reasons to work with a team on these types of decisions. So hopefully this was helpful. If you really like the concepts that we talked about today, feel free to request my book called I Hate Taxes. If you've been watching for this long, go ahead in the description below. You can request a book, put your address in, we'll mail it out to you, and so that you can get more resources for retirement and know how to best plan for your retirement. And so with that being said, that's all I've got on today's episode of Joe Knows Retirement, and we'll catch you on the next one.